The late sun hung low, bleeding gold and rust across the rooftops of the little frontier town. Heat clung to the boards of the walkways and to the backs of the townsfolk gathering in a slow, uneasy circle before the whitewashed church. Boots scuffed dust into the still air. The bell in the steeple tolled with a hollow, almost reluctant note, though the faces below showed no such reluctance. She stood at the center, wrists bound behind her, a thin smear of dried blood at the corner of her mouth. Her dress was torn at the shoulder where someone had grabbed her too hard. Dust clung to her cheekbones, though it did nothing to dim the fierce set of her jaw. No tears. No pleas. Only the flicker of her gaze across the crowd. Searching faces, measuring the weight of every staring eye. The preacher's voice carried like a whip itself, sharp, clean, without hesitation. He did not speak to her so much as over her, eyes sweeping the gathered flock. He spoke of sin, of scandal, of protecting the town's good name. His words had the smoothness of someone who had told this story before, though perhaps not in this exact form. Behind him, the church doors were shut tight, as though God himself might not wish to witness what his people were about to do. The man who stepped forward to carry out the sentence was broad-shouldered and expressionless. The leather strap in his hand was coiled like a sleeping serpent, its surface darkened with oil, its edges frayed from use. He didn't look at her. He looked at the preacher, waiting for the word. It came with a nod. The first strike split the air with a crack that sent a shiver through the bystanders. She did not cry out. The second landed, biting into cloth and skin alike, leaving a thin, angry welt. A murmur ran through the crowd, some leaning forward as if to drink in the spectacle, others shifting uneasily, their eyes darting anywhere but toward her. Each lash was its own small storm. The whistling arc, the thud of impact, the rush of breath as pain drove into bone. Between blows, the sound the prairie wind slipped through, as if the land itself were holding its breath. On the far edge of the gathering, a figure stood apart, lean frame, dust-worn duster coat, hanging loose over one shoulder. A brim of weather-darkened felt shaded his eyes, but the angle of his jaw caught the light. He leaned against a hitching post as though he'd been there for hours, unmoving, watching. He didn't call out. He didn't so much as flinch when the whip cracked again. She stumbled, knees threatening to fold. Her breath came in tight pulls, her head low, but still she did not make a sound. The man with the strap adjusted his grip and brought it down harder. Her body jerked once, and her bound hand strained against the rope until the skin tore at her wrists. Somewhere in the watching ring, a mother pulled her young boy away, hurrying down the street with her head bowed. Others stayed. A man near the front spat into the dirt. When the preacher raised his hand, the beating stopped. The executioner stepped back, chest heaving. She hung in the ropes, swaying faintly, hair plastered her cheek with sweat. For a moment, there was no sound at all but the wind scraping dust across the boards. The preacher's tone softened now, the performance over. He declared the town cleansed, the lesson made. He turned his back, heading for the steps, the crowd parting for him with reverence. One by one, they left her there, some with faces set in grim satisfaction, others unwilling to meet her eyes. Before long, the street was nearly empty, except for him. The stranger pushed away from the post, his boots carrying him through the settling dust. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though the world around him had slowed to match his pace. When he reached her, he stood close enough for the smell of leather and gun oil to cut through the air between them. She lifted her head just enough to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He reached up, loosened the knot at her wrist, and caught her before she could fall. His hands were strong, steady, holding her as if she weighed nothing. Without a word, he turned from the church and began walking down the street, her weight cradled against his chest. Behind them, the bell tolled once more, its echo fading into the long breath of the prairie. The last of the sunlight slipped behind the horizon, and the shadows swallowed them both. Rain began as a whisper, a fine mist over the prairie, soft against the brim of his hat. The town lay behind them, its lantern glow shrinking into the dark, each step of his boots pressing deeper into the wet earth. She stirred faintly in his arms, the weight of her breath warmed through his coat. Her lashes fluttered once, catching a glint of light before falling still again. A mile out, He found a half-collapsed barn hunched at the edge of an open field. The roof sagged, but still held enough to keep the rain off. Inside, the air smelled of old hay and dust, with a faint trace of horses long gone. He set her down gently on a bed of straw, his movements economical, each one deliberate. She tried to push herself upright, but the moment her palms took weight, pain flashed across her face. He crouched beside her, opened a worn leather satchel, and pulled out a water flask. He held it out without a word. Her eyes narrowed, suspicion and exhaustion mingling, but she drank. His hands worked quietly, untying the rope burns at her wrists, cleaning the welts along her back with a cloth dipped in the cool water. Each touch was careful but without softness, as if he knew that gentleness might make the pain worse. She studied him in the dim light, catching small details, the worn stitching on his coat sleeve, the faint scar running from the corner of his jaw into his beard, the calluses that came from more than just ranch work. "You gonna tell me why you stepped in?" Her voice was rough, not from disuse, but from holding back cries hours earlier. He didn't look at her when he answered, didn't like the look of it. "That's it. That's enough." Silence settled again. He rinsed the cloth, wrung it out, and pressed it against a deeper cut along her shoulder blade. She winced but didn't pull away. Outside, the rain thickened, drumming softly against the tin roof. She tried to read him, this stranger who'd walked into her life between a whip's crack and the preacher's final sermon. There was no badge on his chest, no mark of allegiance to the town. The set of his jaw spoke of a man accustomed to keeping his own counsel. "You got a name?" she asked. He met her eyes for the first time. The look wasn't unkind, but it was final. Not tonight. Something in the way he said it told her she'd get no more. Not yet. She let it rest, though her mind was far from still. When she lay back, staring up at the beams of the roof, he stepped outside, through the broken doorway. She could see him leaning against the wall, rolling a cigarette with the patience of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. A small match flare lit his face for a heartbeat, lines carved deep, not just in the sun. She closed her eyes, listening to the faint rasp of him drawing smoke, to the way the barn seemed to breathe with the wind. Her body ached in every place that had been struck, but something heavier pressed against her chest. The memory of the preacher's voice, the certainty in it, the way the crowd's eyes had slid away from hers, as if that would keep them clean. When she opened them again, he was back inside. He'd taken off his coat and laid it over her, the weight of it smelling faintly of leather and gunpowder. "Sleep," he said. It wasn't a request. She didn't argue. The last thing she saw before drifting under was him settling down near the barn door, rifle resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. Hours later, a sharp sound woke her. Hoofbeats, faint but coming closer. She sat up, every muscle protesting, and saw him already standing, rifle raised, body angled toward the sound. The rain had eased, and through the crack in the wall she glimpsed 3 shadows moving in the moonlight, their shapes shifting against the grass. He glanced back at her once, a silent warning, then stepped into the night. The hoofbeats slowed. A voice called out, muffled by the damp air. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was casual in a way that only meant danger. His reply was low, too low for her to catch, but she felt it in the way the silence afterwards seemed to stretch. One of the riders laughed. The sound was short-lived. A single shot cracked the night, loud and certain, followed by the scramble of retreating hooves. When he came back inside, he didn't speak. He closed the satchel, tightened the strap, and began saddling his horse. "We're leaving?" she asked. He gave her the same look as before, steady, unreadable. "They'll be back with more." And just like that, she knew the night's quiet was gone, replaced by the hard certainty of pursuit. The preacher hadn't been finished with her, and the man who had pulled her from the dirt had just painted a target on them both. The barn door swung wide, letting the pale light of a washed-out moon spill across the floor. He mounted without hurry, then reached a hand down toward her. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Then she took it. The horse turned toward the open plains, and the two of them rode into the wet darkness, the world narrowing to the sound of hooves, and the thought that every mile put them closer to whatever storm was waiting. The morning came pale and cold, the kind of light that flattened the land into shades of gray. They rode without speaking, the sound of the horses' hooves muffled in the damp earth. The rain had washed the air clean, but it had also erased the trail behind them, at least for a time. She sat behind him, her arms loosely at his waist, eyes scanning the horizon. When the first column of smoke rose in the distance, she thought it was a homestead fire. He slowed the horse, studying it. The smoke was too thin, too steady. His gaze shifted to the faint glint of sunlight off metal far out on the plains. She felt him tense under her hands. "They're coming," he said. Her stomach tightened. "The men from last night?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. He urged the horse into a trot, angling away from the smoke. The wind picked up, carried with the faint scent of burning pine, though there were no trees for miles. It felt wrong, deliberate, as though someone had set a signal. By noon, they'd reached a shallow creek. He dismounted, letting the horse drink while he scanned the ridges to the west. She slid to the ground, every muscle in her back protesting, but kept her eyes on him. His stillness was sharper than movement. Every line of his body coiled. "You could leave me," she said. It wasn't a plea. He glanced at her once, then back to the ridge. "Could. But you won't." His jaw tightened. "Not my way." She didn't know whether to call it kindness or stubbornness. Either way, it bound them together more tightly than the rope had bound her the day before. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow slipping across the grass. She followed it with her gaze until movement caught her eye. A line of riders cresting the far hill, dark against the sky. He saw them too. He moved fast then, mounting in one fluid motion, and pulling her up after him. They splashed through the creek, the water cold around her boots, then climbed the opposite bank. The riders didn't hurry. They followed at a steady pace, certain they had their quarry. An hour passed like that, the distance between them neither shrinking nor growing. He led them through low gullies and narrow passes, always choosing routes that kept them out of sight from the open plains. The sun slid westward, the shadows lengthening. When they stopped in a narrow ravine to rest the horse, she asked a question that had been pressing against her tongue since dawn. "What did the preacher say about me? Why were they so sure I needed punishing?" He was silent for a long moment. Then, "Said you stole from the church. Took something worth more than gold to him." Her laugh was short, bitter. "And did you believe him? If I had, you'd still be tied to that fence." She studied his face, the steady way he met her gaze. Something in his eyes told her he already suspected there was more than theft, more than the preacher's words could cover. Before she could speak, the crack of a rifle echoed off the ravine walls. The horse reared, and he forced it down with a firm hand. Another shot followed. Kicking dirt inches from his boot, he shoved the reins into her hands. "Ride. What about you? Go." She wanted to argue, but the look he gave her ended it. She kicked the horse forward, the ravine narrowing ahead. Behind her, the deep, deliberate sound of his rifle firing carried on the wind. She rode hard, branches scraping her arms where the ravine grew tight. A third shot rang out, not as... The air smelled of powder and fear. When she reached a bend, she pulled the horse to a stop and looked back. He came into view moments later, moving quickly but not running, his rifle still in hand. A streak of blood marked his sleeve, but his stride was steady. "They're split," he said when he reached her. "Half are circling ahead." Her heart thudded. "So they'll be waiting, unless we make them think otherwise." He led the horse up a narrow slope, the kind that looked impassable from below. Loose stones slid under their boots, the air growing thin. When they reached the crest, the land fell away to a hidden basin, sheltered from the wind. A trickle of water ran through it, and the grass was high enough to hide them from sight. They waited there, the hours marked only by the slow dip of the sun. She found herself watching the way he moved, how he never sat with his back to open ground, how his eyes kept shifting to the ridges, counting seconds between glances. When the first shadow passed along the far slope, he raised a hand for silence. The riders appeared one by one, scanning the ravine below where they had been earlier. Their voices carried faintly, frustrated. After a time, they rode on, their shapes swallowed by the distance. Only when the last hoofbeat faded did he lower his hand. "They'll try again," she said quietly. He nodded. "They don't quit easy." "And you?" His eyes met hers. The faintest curve was something like a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Neither do I." The light was going. The basin darkened first, the shadow of the ridge sliding across them until they were part of it. Somewhere out on the plains, the preacher's men would be making camp, thinking they'd flush their quarry at dawn. She knew now they wouldn't stop, not until they had her, or until they were stopped themselves. The thought should have filled her with dread. But when she looked at him, rifle resting across his knees, she felt something else entirely. She didn't know yet if it was safety, but it was steady, and for tonight, that was enough. The storm broke before dawn, a hard, unrelenting rain that turned the earth to black muck and blurred the horizon into a shifting wall of water. They rode toward it anyway. The horses' flanks dark with sweat, their clothes plastered to their skin. The air carried a metallic taste, sharp as the edge of a blade, and each gust of wind drove the rain sideways into their faces. The town appeared in pieces. First the shadow of the steeple against the gray, then the row of shuttered buildings, their windows dark. The streets were empty, the mud churned only by the wind. He guided the horse straight down the center, the echo of hooves swallowed by the storm. She could feel the tension in him, the way his muscles stayed coiled even in the saddle, eyes sweeping each doorway. At the church steps he swung down, boots sinking deep into the mud. He reached up and helped her down, his hand steady despite the cold. The bell above clanged once, caught by the wind, its tone flat and hollow. Without a word, he pushed the doors open and stepped inside. Warmth at them first. Heat from the fire at the altar, though the air smelled of damp wood and sweat. The preacher stood at the pulpit, robes darkened with rain where he'd been outside moments before. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second. Then his expression smoothed into a mask of righteous calm. Around him, a dozen men shifted in the pews, their hands resting just close enough to the grips of their revolvers to be no accident. "You bring her back," the preacher said, his voice carrying over the sound of rain hammering the roof. "You did right." The cowboy didn't answer. His gaze moved over men in the pews, measuring distance, the angle of their shoulders. She could feel the heat of his presence even from a step behind, the way the air seemed to narrow between him and the rest of the room. "She's guilty," the preacher went on, his tone building. "She stole from God himself. You've done your part, now stand aside. What did she take?" His voice was quiet, but it cut through the space like a blade. The preacher's lips tightened. "Faith, trust, the unity of this town." "That's not an answer," she said. Her voice trembled, but it wasn't fear, it was fury. "Tell her what you really did." A ripple of movement ran through the pews. The preacher's eyes flicked toward the men nearest the door. "You've been misled." She'd see this town burn for her sins. The cowboy stepped forward, the boards under his boots creaking. "Last night," he said, 3 of your men came looking. This morning, 5 more followed. Seems you want her bad enough to bleed for it. So I'll ask once what she's worth to you." The preacher's mask cracked, just enough of the truth to slip through. "More than you can imagine." Lightning split the sky, flooding the windows with white light. The first gunshot came an instant later, deafening in the enclosed space. The cowboy dropped low, pulling her with him behind the nearest pew. Splinters flew as bullets tore through the wood. He returned fire in measured bursts, each shot deliberate, each followed by a body hitting the floor. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, the air thick with smoke and the acrid sting of gunpowder. Men shouted, boots thudding on the floorboards. The preacher's voice rose above it all, urging them on, spitting scripture-like curses. When the gunfire lulled, she risked a glance over the pew. The preacher was retreating toward the altar, his hand on something hidden beneath the cloth. She saw it then, a small ornate lockbox, brass edges catching the light. Her breath caught. "That's what you wanted," she said to the cowboy. "Not gold. What's inside it?" He nodded once, eyes never leaving the preacher. "Stay here." He moved like water, low and quick, weaving between pews until he was close enough to draw a bead on the man at the altar. The preacher saw him coming and yanked the box free, holding it to his chest. "You'll have to kill me," he hissed. "Maybe," the cowboy said. Or maybe I let her do it. The preacher's eyes darted toward her, just as she stepped into the aisle. Her hands were steady now, her steps measured, the distance between them close in slow, deliberate heartbeats. When she reached him, she didn't speak. She simply drew the knife from her belt and drove it into the space just below his ribs. His breath left him in a wet gasp. The box slipped from his hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. He crumpled beside it, his fingers twitching once before going still. For a moment, the only sound was the rain on the roof. Then the cowboy stepped forward, picked up the box, and tucked it into his coat. "What's in it?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. Not tonight. They walked out together, past the bodies, past the blood soaking into the boards. The storm had eased, the rain thinning to a steady drizzle. Outside, the air smelled of wet earth and something cleaner, sharper, the kind of scent that came after lightning burned the sky. He helped her into the saddle, then swung up behind her. The town lay silent around them, the church a dark shape against the clearing sky. They rode without looking back, the mud sucking at the horses' hooves, until the road turned to firmer ground. As dawn broke over the plains, the first light caught on the edge of the lockbox hidden in his coat. She didn't ask again. Some truths could wait. They kept riding, the horizon wide and endless before them, the wind tugging at their coats like a promise that the road ahead would not be gentle, but would be theirs.